A man knows when something he built is breaking. You can hear it in the way a floorboard groans underfoot. See it in the way a joint starts to loosen. The problem is, sometimes you don't notice the cracks until it's too late. My name is Richard Harrison. I'm 55 years old, and I've been working with my hands my whole life. Built my first chair when I was 12, started my own carpentry shop when I was 25, and spent the last 30 years making a name for myself. My shop, Harrison Woodworks, is the kind of place folks in Lincoln Lynn know they can count on. Built the shelves in the library, the tables in the church hall, even a custom bar top over at the Oakwood Grill. Everything I make is solid, built to last. Marriage ought to be the same way. Audrey and I met in high school. I was a rough kid, already working summers with my old man, covered in sawdust half the time. She was the kind of girl who always looked put together, smart, driven. I figured we balanced each other out. And for a long time we did. Raised 3 kids, built a life. That night, our anniversary, I was feeling good. The kids were grown, the shop was running smooth, and for once, I had the time to sit across from my wife at the Oakwood. A nice steak in front of me, a drink in my hand, and not feel rushed. Audrey looked nice. Hair done up, gold necklace I'd bought her years back resting against her collarbone. But something felt off. She kept checking her phone, tapping her nails against the table. When I reached for my drink, my hand brushed hers, and she pulled back quick, like I was a stranger. I didn't say anything, just watched. "Everything all right?" I asked after a few minutes, cutting into my steak. She barely looked up. "Yeah, just a long day at work." Audrey was good at keeping things neat. She was always careful, always composed. But I knew her better than that. I noticed the way her fingers curled slightly, like she wanted to grab her phone again. The way she wasn't really looking at me, just past me, like she was waiting for someone to walk through the door. I chewed my food, let the silence settle. No need to push. If something's loose, sometimes it's best to let it come apart on its own. The waiter came by, topping off my drink. "How's everything tonight?" "Great," I said, setting my fork down. "Best steak in town." Audrey barely nodded. When dessert came, she excused herself to the restroom. That's when I saw it. The champagne glass in front of me. Thin-stemmed, delicate, not the kind of thing I usually liked, had a crack running straight through it. I turned it in my hand, watching how the light caught the fracture. You don't always see the damage right away. Sometimes you've got to hold it up to the light. Audrey came back, smoothing her dress like she was shaking off something unseen. "Ready to go?" I nodded, set the glass down, and left it behind. At home, I emptied my pockets onto the kitchen counter, wallet, keys, receipts. Habit. Audrey went straight upstairs, said she had emails to check. I opened the fridge, grabbed a beer. Something kept scratching at the back of my head. I walked over to the entryway, picked up Audrey's purse. Not something I normally did, but something had me looking. I pulled it open, pushing past her compact, her work badge, her neatly folded receipts. Then I felt it. A motorcycle key. Not mine. The metal was worn, the logo half rubbed off, but I knew a Harley key when I saw one. I exhaled slowly, closed the purse, and set it back exactly how I found it. Then I took a sip of my beer, letting the cold settle in my chest. There it was, the crack in the wood. Now all I had to do was figure out just how deep it ran. I set my beer down on the counter and leaned against the sink, staring at the dark window above it. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the floorboards upstairs. Audrey was probably in bed by now, under the covers, phone screen lighting up her face. I used to think she was scrolling through emails, maybe a book. Now I wasn't so sure. I wasn't the type to make accusations without proof. A man builds things with precision, measures twice, cuts once. This was no different. I wasn't about to storm up there and start yelling, make a fool of myself if I was wrong. If something was broken, I needed to see it with my own eyes. The next morning, I got up early like always, brewed coffee, and headed to the shop. Harrison Woodworks was a 15-minute drive from the house, set just off Main Street, a squat brick building with a big roll-up garage door. The place smelled like sawdust and varnish, like work. My son-in-law, Michael, was already there, pulling boards from the back. "Morning," I said, grabbing my tool belt. "Morning, Richard," he said, brushing wood shavings off his jeans. "Got the cabinet frames cut yesterday. Just need to sand 'em down." "Good," I nodded. "Keep 'em tight. No gaps." "Wouldn't dare," he grinned. Michael was a good kid, married to my eldest, Emily. He was still learning, still rough around the edges, but he listened. More importantly, he worked hard. I spent the next few hours at the table saw, letting the work settle my mind. Wood was simple. It told you exactly what it was: straight grain, clean knots, nothing hidden. People, though? People had layers. Around noon, I pulled out my phone and sent a message to an old friend, Sheriff Tom Wilkins. "Me, got a question. Meet me at Rudy's?" A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Tom, 2 o'clock. That afternoon, I pulled into Rudy's Diner, a little roadside joint that had been there since before I was born. Tom was already inside, sipping coffee, his uniform shirt stretched over a belly that hadn't seen a treadmill in years. "Richard," he nodded, setting his cup down as I slid into the booth. "What's on your mind?" I signaled the waitress for coffee. "Need some info." Quietly. Tom studied me for a second, then leaned back. "That kind of thing, huh?" "Yeah." He stirred his coffee, took a slow sip. "How bad?" "Bad enough that I need to ask you if there's a guy in town who rides a Harley and is real familiar with the Stonebrick Inn." Tom raised an eyebrow. "That's specific." I didn't answer. Just waited. After a beat, he sighed, scratched his chin. "Thomas's Auto and Cycle. Ryan Thomas. Runs the place, does repair work, sells bikes on the side." "Thomas," I repeated, filing the name away. "You know anything about him?" Tom shrugged. "Not much. Divorced. Ex-wife left town a couple years back. Never been in real trouble, but he's got a reputation. Likes to play reckless. Women, gambling, whatever keeps the blood pumping." He glanced at me. "That who you're looking for?" "We'll see," I said, sliding a 20 across the table. Tom didn't touch it. "You sure you want to go down this road?" I met his eyes. Not a damn doubt in my mind. That evening, I got home just as Audrey was pulling into the driveway. She stepped out of her car, adjusting her bag on her shoulder, looking like she'd just come from work. I watched her from the porch, beer in hand. "Long day?" I asked. She glanced up, startled for half a second before smoothing her expression. "Yeah. Meetings all afternoon." I took a slow sip. "Boss still writing you about those reports?" She blinked, then forced a small laugh. "Yeah, you know how it is." I did. I knew exactly how it was. That night, I waited until she was asleep before I picked up her phone from the nightstand. Just held it in my hand, watching the faint glow of the screen. She had a password now. She never used to. I put it back and walked downstairs, out to the garage, where my tools were lined up on the wall. Running my fingers over the worn wooden handles, I thought about the motorcycle key, the hotel receipt, the name Tom had given me. Measure twice. Cut once. I knew exactly where to start. I sat in my truck outside Thomas's Auto and Cycle, tapping my fingers against the steering wheel, watching. The place was exactly what I expected: grimy, cluttered with half-assembled bikes, the smell of oil and burnt rubber hanging in the air. A couple of guys were working on a Harley near the bay doors, but I wasn't here for them. Then I saw him. Ryan Thomas stepped out from the shop, wiping his hands on a rag. Broad shoulders, scruffy beard, leather jacket that had seen better days. He had that walk, the kind of stride men get when they think they own the world. A woman leaned against the counter near him, laughing at something he said. He smirked, tossing the rag onto a toolbox, flexing a little too much for a guy changing brake pads. I'd seen his type before. Guys like him built nothing, left wreckage in their wake, and kept moving. I pulled out my phone and sent a text. "Me, found him. Let's talk." 15 minutes later, I was parked outside Amanda Thomas's house, Ryan's ex-wife. Tom had given me her address, and I figured she might have a few things to say about her former husband. The door opened before I even knocked. Amanda was in her late 30s, dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail, wearing a sweatshirt and jeans. She looked me up and down, arms crossed. "You're Richard Harrison," she said flatly. "That's right. I know why you're here." She stepped aside. "Come in." I followed her into a tidy little living room, the kind where everything had its place. No clutter, no wasted space. She pointed to the couch. "Sit." I did. She sat across from me, arms still folded. "You're not the first man to come knocking about Ryan." "I bet," I said, leaning forward. "How many?" "Enough," she snorted. "He gets bored easy. Always looking for the next thrill. I nodded, keeping my face neutral. How'd it end for you? Amanda huffed a laugh. Messy. Caught him sneaking around, gave him a choice, fix it or leave. He left. Sound like him, I muttered. She tilted her head. Your wife. I nodded once. Amanda exhaled sharply, shaking her head. I don't know what you're planning, Richard, but I'll tell you this, Ryan doesn't care. He doesn't feel bad. He gets off on this kind of thing. I watched her closely. You still talk to him? She frowned. Not if I can help it. But you still have his number. Her mouth pressed into a line. What are you thinking? I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over the screen. I want to end it before he does. Amanda hesitated, then reached for her phone. All right, but you better know what you're doing. By the time I left her house, I had what I needed, a plan. A good one. The next morning, I made a call to an old friend who ran a private security firm in Nashville. Told him I needed a favor. He didn't ask questions. A few hours later, I had Ryan's full schedule, where he worked, where he drank, who he spent time with. Turns out he wasn't as careful as he thought. The first thing I did was take away his playground. A contractor I knew put in a call to the landlord of Thomas's Auto and Cycle, mentioned a serious complaint about stolen parts. Suddenly, Ryan's shop was under a surprise inspection by the county. I made sure the local auto shop owners got wind of it, too. Within a day, 2 of his biggest suppliers put his orders on hold. The next thing I did was take away his peace of mind. Amanda, following my suggestion, sent Audrey a message from Ryan's phone, just a simple text, "We need to talk. Meet me at the Barrel House tonight." Then she blocked Audrey's number. That night, I parked outside the Barrel House bar, watching from across the lot as Audrey arrived. She stepped inside, glancing around. She looked nervous, her hands gripping the strap of her purse too tight. She didn't see me, but I saw everything. And then she saw Amanda. Audrey froze. Amanda just smiled and sipped her drink, watching as realization hit. Audrey turned on her heel and left, moving fast, head down. I waited a beat, then pulled away, heading home. When I walked into the house, Audrey was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale. She looked up at me like she was trying to read something in my face. You okay? I asked, real casual. She hesitated. Yeah. Just, long day. I nodded, grabbed a beer from the fridge. Yeah. I bet. I let the silence settle between us. Audrey kept staring at the table, fingers drumming lightly. I took a slow sip of my drink and waited. Measure twice. Cut once. Tomorrow, I'd make the final cut. The next morning, I woke up early, same as always. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, but Audrey wasn't downstairs. Her car was still in the driveway, so I knew she hadn't left yet. I poured myself a cup, took a sip, and waited. A minute later, I heard her footsteps on the stairs. She walked in, still in her robe, hair tied up, moving slower than usual. She wasn't the kind to sleep in. That was the first sign she was off her game. You all right? I asked, setting my mug down. She gave a weak smile. Didn't sleep much. No? She shook her head, moved to the fridge, but I could tell she wasn't really looking for anything. She was stalling. I let the silence stretch. Finally, she closed the fridge door and turned to face me. Richard, is everything okay with us? I took another sip of coffee, watching her over the rim of my cup. Why do you ask? She hesitated. I don't know. You've been different. I nodded slowly. Huh. Audrey exhaled, gripping the counter behind her like she needed something to hold onto. Things feel off. If there's something wrong, I want to talk about it. I watched her closely. Not once did she say I did something wrong. She wasn't asking if she had done anything. She wanted me to make it easy for her, to give her something to work with so she could twist it, control the direction of the conversation. That wasn't going to happen. I leaned back against the table, crossed my arms. You sure there's nothing you want to tell me? Her jaw tightened. Like what? A test. She was still trying to see how much I knew. I shrugged. I don't know. Just seems like you've had a lot on your mind lately. She swallowed. Work's been stressful. I let out a low chuckle. Yeah, I bet. For a split second, something flickered across her face. Guilt? Fear? Hard to say. She opened her mouth like she was about to say something, then closed it again. Instead, she turned back toward the fridge. That told me everything I needed to know. That afternoon, I made another call to Audrey's father. Lincoln Vaughn was an old-school type, Vietnam vet, still sharp, still tough as nails. He respected men who took care of their families and had no patience for those who didn't. I'd always gotten along with him, but I knew this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. Richard, he answered after 2 rings, voice steady as ever. Everything all right? Not really, I said. Need to talk. In person. There was a short pause. Then come by the house. An hour later, I was sitting in his den, an old-fashioned room with a heavy oak desk and bookshelves lined with military history. Lincoln sat across from me, hands folded on his lap, waiting. I took a breath, then laid it out, no fluff, no sugarcoating. I told him what I knew, how I knew it, and what I planned to do. I expected some kind of explosion, rage, disbelief, something. But Lincoln just sat there, listening, jaw tight, knuckles white against his chair. When I finished, he nodded once. "Audrey doesn't know you know?" "Not yet." He was silent for a moment, then said, "Bring her here. Tonight." That was it. No long speeches, no dramatics. Just a command. That night, I walked into the living room, keys in hand. Audrey was on the couch, staring at her laptop, but I could tell she wasn't really seeing anything on the screen. She looked up when she heard me. "Come with me," I said. She blinked. "Where?" "Your parents' house." She frowned, shutting the laptop. "Why?" I held her gaze. "They want to talk." She hesitated for a second too long. Then she nodded, closing the laptop, grabbing her coat. She was nervous now, but she still thought she had room to maneuver. That was about to change. The drive was quiet. She didn't ask questions, didn't reach for the radio like she usually did. Her fingers tapped against her knee, a nervous habit. When we pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on. Audrey let out a slow breath and got out of the car. Inside, Lincoln and her mother, Margaret, were waiting in the living room. Audrey barely had time to greet them before Lincoln spoke. "Sit down," he said. She hesitated but did as she was told. I took the seat next to her, pulling out my phone. Then I hit play. The audio was crystal clear. Audrey's voice, soft but unmistakable, laughing, murmuring. Ryan's voice, lower, cocky, saying things no husband should ever have to hear. Audrey went pale. Her hands clenched into fists on her lap. Her mother covered her mouth with her hand, eyes wet with shock. Lincoln didn't move. When the audio ended, the silence was thick enough to suffocate. Audrey finally found her voice, but it was barely above a whisper. "Richard." I didn't let her finish. "You lied to me. Every single day you lied." My voice was calm, level, but she flinched like I'd shouted. She shook her head. "I never meant." "Don't." She swallowed hard, eyes flicking toward her father. "Dad, please, Lincoln cut her off. "No. You don't talk." His voice was stone. "You listen." Audrey's lip trembled. I saw it then, the moment she realized she had no control left. No excuses to give. "You made your choice," I said, standing up. "Now you get to live with it." I dropped the divorce papers on the coffee table. Audrey stared at them, her breathing shaky. Then I walked out. The morning after I left Audrey sitting in her parents' living room, I woke up before sunrise like always. The house was quiet, empty in a way I hadn't felt before. No sound of the shower running, no faint shuffle of her footsteps upstairs. Just silence. I made coffee, black and strong, and took it out to the back porch. The air was crisp, the kind that smelled like rain was coming. I sat down in the old wooden chair I'd built years ago, ran my hand over the armrest, feeling the worn grooves. I'd built this house with my own hands. Every beam, every joint, every damn nail was placed with purpose. And now, for the first time, it didn't feel like home. I wasn't the type to sit around and dwell on things. A man either fixed what was broken or he tore it down and built something better. That's what today was about. At the shop, Michael was already unloading a shipment of oak planks. He looked up as I stepped inside, his expression careful. He knew. Everybody in town probably knew by now. "Morning," I said, grabbing my tool belt. "Morning." He hesitated. "You, doing all right?" I picked up a measuring tape, running my thumb over the metal edge. "Yeah. Just another day." Michael nodded, but he didn't look convinced. I didn't care. I wasn't interested in sympathy. By mid-morning, I was waist-deep in work, hands moving on autopilot. The shop smelled like sawdust and sweat, the steady whine of the saw filling the space. It was good. Familiar. But every now and then, my mind drifted. Not to Audrey. I was done thinking about her. No, I was thinking about what came next. At noon, I locked up early and drove out to Lake Winston. The cabin had been sitting empty for months. A project I'd meant to start but kept putting off. Now, it seemed like the perfect time. The place was old, built back in the 40s, sturdy but in need of work. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under my boots. Dust floated in the slanted sunlight coming through the windows. I could fix this. I would fix this. I spent the rest of the afternoon gutting the place, tearing out warped floorboards, prying up rusted nails. It was the best I'd felt in weeks. By the time I got back into town, the sun was sinking low, painting everything in burnt orange. I stopped at Wilkins Hardware, figuring I'd grab a few supplies. Richard, the owner, Dave Wilkins, greeted me as I stepped inside. "Heard about, well, everything." I grabbed a box of screws, kept my expression neutral. That's so. Dave exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Small town. That it is. He hesitated, then leaned in slightly. For what it's worth, most folks are on your side. I huffed a laugh. There's sides to this? Dave shrugged. Man works his whole life to build something, people respect that. Ain't right what she did. I nodded, grabbed a roll of sandpaper. Appreciate it, Dave. He rang me up then, as I turned to leave, he said, by the way, Sarah was asking about you. I stopped. Sarah? The baker. Runs Sweetwater Bakery on Maple. He smirked. Said she heard you were fixing up that old cabin. Something about how it's good to see a man who knows how to build something right. I shook my head, not in the mood for whatever this was. I'm not looking for anything like that. Dave held up his hands. Didn't say you were. I walked out without another word. That night, back at the house, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the divorce papers Audrey had left on the counter. Signed. It was done. I picked them up, folded them neatly, and set them in a drawer. Then I grabbed a beer, stepped onto the back porch, and watched the sky fade from orange to deep blue. Tomorrow, I'd go back to the cabin. Tomorrow, I'd keep building. The next morning, I loaded up the truck with tools and supplies, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and headed back to Lake Winston. The sun was barely up when I pulled in, the gravel crunching under my tires. The cabin sat there, solid but weathered, waiting for someone to give it another shot. I stepped inside, took a slow breath. Smelled like dust, wood, and time. Good bones, just needed work. I could relate. By mid-morning, I had the front porch ripped up, the rotted boards piled off to the side. Sweat rolled down my back as I measured out new beams, the rhythm of work settling into me. It was simple, cut, fit, nail. No lies, no excuses, no guessing. Just doing the job right. A truck pulled up around noon. I wiped my hands on my jeans, turned to see Michael climbing out. He held up a bag from the corner deli. Figured you probably didn't stop to eat. I took the bag, pulled out a sandwich. Appreciate it. Michael leaned against the truck, arms crossed, watching as I took a bite. Emily's pissed at Audrey, he said finally. I chewed, swallowed. Yeah? She won't even take her calls. Told her flat out she doesn't respect her anymore. He shook his head. I didn't think Em could even get mad like that. I nodded. She's got a good head on her shoulders. Michael hesitated. Audrey, she asked about you. I kept eating. Said she wanted to know if you were okay. I crumpled the sandwich wrapper, tossed it in the truck bed. She lost the right to ask that. Michael nodded like he expected that answer. Guess so. He kicked at a rock with the toe of his boot. For what it's worth, Em and I are here if you need anything. I know. We finished lunch in silence, then he helped me lay the new porch beams before heading back into town. By late afternoon, I was back at Wilkins Hardware, picking up a few more supplies. The bell over the door jingled as I walked in, and this time I didn't get 2 steps inside before I heard a familiar voice. Didn't take you for the kind of man who needed baking supplies. I turned. Sarah Whitmore stood near the counter, arms crossed, a half-smile on her face. Late 40s, sharp eyes, the kind of posture that said she wasn't easily knocked off balance. Flour dusted the sleeve of her shirt. I grabbed a pack of nails off the shelf. Didn't take you for the kind of woman who hung around hardware stores. She smirked. I don't. Just picking up some stuff for the bakery. Dave chuckled from behind the register. Told you she was asking about you. Sarah shot him a look. You talk too much. Dave just grinned. I set my items on the counter, pulled out my wallet. I appreciate the concern, but I'm not looking for anything. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Did I say you were? I exhaled, shaking my head. No, I suppose you didn't. She studied me for a second, then said, I was just gonna say, I heard you're fixing up that cabin on Lake Winston. You planning on keeping it or selling? I thought about it, about the space, the quiet, the fresh start. Keeping it. She nodded. Good. It deserves to last. I met her eyes. Yeah, it does. She gave me one last look, then picked up her bag and walked out. I paid for my things, tossed them in the truck, and headed back to the cabin. That night, I stood on the newly built porch, beer in hand, watching the water. The wood beneath me was solid, strong. A foundation worth standing on. Audrey was a part of my past. This was my future. And I was damn well going to build it right. A year later, I stood on the porch of the cabin, watching the lake stretch out in front of me. The wood beneath my boots was solid, every board laid by my own hands. The place was finished now, new floors, fresh coat of paint, a stone fireplace that I built myself. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. Behind me, inside, Michael was helping my grandson sand down a small piece of pine. The kid was barely 6, but he already had the grip of someone who understood the weight of a tool in his hands. His little face was scrunched in concentration, his small fingers moving slow, careful. Gentle, Michael said. Let the grain tell you where to go. The kid nodded, focused. I watched them for a moment, then turned back to the lake. A truck pulled up the gravel road, kicking up dust. Dave Wilkins climbed out, a brown envelope in his hand. He walked up the porch steps, held it out. That the last of it? I asked, already knowing the answer. Dave nodded. Signed, sealed, done. You're officially single, my friend. I took the papers, flipped through them. My name, Audrey's, the official stamp at the bottom. Final. Hell of a year, Dave said, leaning against the railing. That it was. You hear about Ryan? I glanced at him. No. Dave snorted. Got run out of town. Business dried up, lost his shop. Some folks say he took off for Texas, others say Florida. Either way, he's gone. I nodded. No pity, no satisfaction, just another piece of scrap thrown away. Dave took a swig from the Coke he was holding. And Audrey. I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. Haven't seen her. Heard she tried to get a job out of state, but word got around. Guess people don't want someone who screws over the people closest to him. Dave chuckled. Poetic justice. I didn't respond. Just folded the papers neatly and slid them into my back pocket. A breeze rolled in from the lake, cool and steady. The kind that carried away the heat, cleared the air. Inside, my grandson let out a triumphant done and held up his little sanded block. Michael ruffled his hair, laughing. Not bad, kid. Might make a carpenter out of you yet. I took one last look at the water, then stepped inside, where things were real. Where things were built to last. Audrey was a mistake. Ryan was a footnote. But this? This was my legacy. And I'd be damned if I ever let it crack.